Thank you, guys. So, as he said, I'm an automation engineer for CARFAX. Basically, I have everybody here today to talk about how we started with CHEF, and then where we moved on from there. So a lot of times people talk about all of these technical aspects, but they don't really focus on what it takes to actually get your organization using CHEF. Not only using CHEF, but using it successfully. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today. So, as an automation engineer at CARFAX, my focus is infrastructure automation, specifically CHEF, but I've also delved into the realm of Terraform with our cloud team as we focus on migration to AWS. So, just a quick assumptions and expectations that I'm making about you all. This is going to be non-technical. I'm going to be talking a lot about CHEF users, which is my term for my internal users of CHEF, the people that actually consume CHEF at CARFAX. And then by extension, I want to iterate that this is a talk for all skill levels, but also any position in your organization. So you don't have to be a manager to incite change. You can incite change from any layer of the corporate onion. So that's a little bit of what I'm going to talk about today. A little background on how we're using CHEF at CARFAX. So right now we're using CHEF Server and CHEF Client, obviously. We're using Automates for the visualization, but also for workflow. Workflow is a heavy part of our cookbook development pipeline. And we're using that basically to get cookbooks from local user development on their workstations out into our CHEF Server, into our private supermarket, and by extension out into Bitbucket, which is our source control that we use. So we also configure all of our Linux systems, both physical and virtual, with CHEF. Right now we manage about 3,000 nodes. That number is continuing to grow as we extend out. So I anticipate probably within the year we'll probably have around 3,500 to 4,500, depending on how fast we can move, which gets faster by the day. So, into the problems that we faced. I'm going to cover some problems that we faced and how we're solving them, but I want everyone in here to understand that every company is different. So, these are just my suggestions and what I've found with the two companies that I've worked for on how to get people actually using and adopting the tool. So the first thing that I noticed whenever I started at CARFAX in particular, a lot of the users that were using CHEF were unhappy. So they were unhappy because they were frustrated with the tool, but they weren't frustrated with how the tool works. What I mean by that is they were frustrated because there's so many ways to do everything. There were no standards in place. There were no guardrails for them. An extension of that is that we had widespread confusion on best practices. So historically, and this is true kind of today, CHEF is not prescriptive. They want you to be able to use the tool how your company needs to use the tool. That's kind of the blessing and the curse with CHEF. My company, CARFAX, they were kind of used to having this set of best practices that they could either follow or not follow. With CHEF, it was very different because if we asked a question, they would tell us how they thought that we should do it, but they wouldn't give it that CHEF blessing that we were looking for. So we kind of had to come up with our own. There was also knowledge gaps between users and teams. So initially, whenever we started using CHEF, it was a few people in multiple teams. So you would have 4 people on a team of 8 using CHEF, and the other 4 were behind. They didn't know what was going on. So that made us feel like that. I am on the horse, if you're curious. I filmed that before I came in. So they're trying to herd cats. I don't know if you've ever tried, but I have in real life with my 3. It doesn't work. You cannot herd a cat. They do what they want. So what do we do about it? So we took that cat herding and we made it a group effort, coming at it from multiple sides. So one of the first things that I thought was important, which I touched on a little bit, is defining your targets. Who are your chef users? Are they a few people? Is it your team? Or is it multiple teams that are going to be consuming chef? As I mentioned, we had this cross-functional team where some users were using chef, and then we had their home teams, and they weren't using chef. But we quickly realized that by the cross-functional team utilizing chef, it became extremely important for everyone on that team to know how to use chef because it was now a part of their job. They could no longer manage the systems because they didn't know chef. So as we step back to figure out how we could fix this, how we could make the user experience better, we defined our target. And we said everyone, at least in infrastructure for now, needs to know chef. There isn't a few people that need to know it. It is literally everyone here. So that also included some development teams, not all, but some development teams, because an integral part of their job was setting up connections for their applications to run. They could no longer do that because we do that in Chef. So it was important for them to understand the system before we gave them the keys to manage their own destiny. So we also wanted to help all of our users start from the same spot. So one of the problems was we had some users that were really comfortable with Chef. They were really comfortable with the tool. Then we had other users within that same team, as I mentioned, and there was a knowledge gap because they felt like they were falling behind. There was no resource out there to help them get started because these other 4 people were so far ahead of them. Cookbooks were also becoming more complex, which meant that you couldn't just go reach out to Chef's website and look at the documentation anymore. These were CARFAX processes. So one of the things we did to help alleviate that knowledge gap was we put everyone, even the people that had been using Chef for a while, through a internally developed training that we dubbed the CARFAX Chef Essentials training. Chef does offer Chef Essentials, which is critical when you start. But it's important to remember that your process is going to evolve as you go through. It is never going to be the exact same thing that you learned in that Essentials course. So we developed this course to teach from the beginning how we use Chef at CARFAX. So how we use Chef at CARFAX. Sorry, lost my place there. So one of the things that we do in that training, we start off the day by kind of explaining Chef. So we do that overview that you get in a normal Chef Essentials course. We then spend some time setting up everyone's workstations, getting them ready to actually develop cookbooks. And then in the afternoon, we go through and we actually develop a cookbook using CARFAX processes, send it through our delivery or workflow pipeline, and get it out in the Chef server, show how to apply it to a node, and give them all the tools that they need to be able to leave that workshop and start developing with Chef using CARFAX practices. We also have step-by-step documentation that we provide that will take them, and if they're not comfortable after they've left that course, it takes them through every single step of the process. We have a separate document for a new cookbook, for an existing one, because that's a separate process. We also have various help documents out there talking about how we handle cookbook pinnings and how we handle secrets and what you need to do to get those running, just in case. So those trainings that I mentioned, those are offered quarterly by my team. And then also, if there's new hires or if there's a manager that says, hey, I want my team to know Chef, we believe that it's going to be big in our processes, then we offer those on an individual basis. It's really important to offer support to your users. No matter where you are, any of you can do this. It doesn't matter what your position is. Offer support, support each other, and that will help the company reach a larger goal. So another thing that we had to do, especially since we were setting up these trainings, is to standardize similar practices early. So not having any standardization will lead to chaos. It's important to remember that standardization can go one of two ways. You can standardize too much, and then you restrict the ability of people to create. and build. But then if you don't standardize at all, you're leading your company down a really, really treacherous road. So what are we standardizing today? So in order to keep users comfortable and to also make sure that they all are starting from the same spot with something that they know, we've developed an internal cookbook generator, Jim, that's based off of one written by EchoHack. I don't know his name. David, yes. It's based off of his pan generator. We dubbed it Saucepan because that's creative and deals with food. So as part of this generator, we have things like a standardized kitchen YAML file. We've also developed a custom VirtualBox image that is linked in that kitchen YAML, and it mocks exactly what our environment looks like. So their local testing looks exactly like our production environment. We did the cookbook generator because with so many users, it's important to be able to allow them to stay on the same standard, but also be able to update them easily. There is a way to tie into the internal generator and modify it on an individual workstation basis, but the gem was the best bet for us because there's so many users and we wanted to make sure everybody had the exact same thing. As I mentioned, we have the custom VirtualBox image. We also implemented attribute naming standards. So we found early that it was really hard to troubleshoot issues when users had no idea where their attributes were when they were looking at the tree view in Chef Manage. This was before the time of Automate. They didn't know if they were setting the attribute. They didn't know if a public cookbook they were using was setting it. So it was important for us to namespace those so we know exactly what Carfax attributes are touching. So every attribute that is written in a Carfax cookbook is under a Carfax namespace. That way we can quickly go look and say, does that exist? Are we impacting it? We also did something similar for our cookbooks. It was important for us to know the cookbooks that we've developed internally versus the public cookbooks that were being used. Outside of that, we found some public cookbooks needed to be modified and that we had to bring in-house to modify them to suit our needs. So anything that we have touched or written code in starts with a Carfax qualifier. That's for us to know we've touched this. This no longer follows any update sets in the public at all. At that point, we have to update it and maintain it internally. And then there's version pinning. So our environments look a little different. Because of that, we pin all of our cookbooks in the environments. We did this for several reasons, one of them being, and this is the most important one, we had so many teams working on cookbooks. It was hard for them to know what version somebody else was using. Inversely, it was hard for them to be able to keep up with the updates that we push daily to cookbooks. So by pinning in environments and allowing their testing environment locally to match those environments, they're always testing against exactly what is running out in the world. This also led us out of dependency purgatory, I like to call it, because you would have two different teams working on similar cookbooks with similar dependencies, but they'd be pinned to different versions in their metadata. So when you would go to run Chef on this single node that's running these two cookbooks, you would obviously have dependency errors. That opens up discussions for them to go reach out to the other teams and work it out. But sometimes when you need to ship something out, that is not always an option. So for now, we've decided to version pin in environments. That is not for everyone, and that is probably not blessed by Chef. So take that all with a grain of salt. But that is what was best for us. And like I said early in this conversation, it's important to evaluate what is best for you, because it's not going to be the same. All right, so communication is another really important part of all of this Chef stuff. So for us, it was important to give users a safe space to voice pain points and concerns. What I mean by that is we set up weekly Chef user group meetings. Any Chef user that was using Chef in Carfax was welcome to attend. It was an optional meeting, and they could voice their concerns. They could also talk about things that they're doing, things that they might be having problems with, and suggest changes to our environment to make their experience better. When you do this, though, it's important to remember that you need to have a clear agenda. Have something that you want to throw out on the table, but allow users to speak. Just sitting at the head of the table and dictating, which we've done that, I've done that, it's not good, it doesn't work. So give them the ability to talk, so you can really get good feedback out of those meetings. It's also important to remember we're not doing those today. As everyone got more comfortable with Chef, there wasn't really a need for us to all get together once a week. So we will still have quarterly retros where we get all the users together, give us your feedback. I'm always available to them, and they know this, but it just wasn't worth having an hour meeting forever. So keep in mind that that meeting may not last forever, but it is an important safe space for them. And then there's negative versus positive. So what I mean by this is part of the reason why users were so upset is because wisdom of crowds. So if someone shouts into the void, I'm having a bad experience, I don't like this tool, if they shout it loud enough and long enough, everyone around them will start believing this. So it's important to always emphasize a negative versus positive connotation on all of your communication. Don't go into the chef meeting being like, I know this sucks. Make sure that you hear their concerns, you take those concerns in, but don't feed the beast, because it will just keep them upset. It will just keep them angry. Always try to put a positive connotation on it, but also respect that there may be problems. And then set realistic expectations. So forcing everyone into the same learning curve does not work. People learn differently, and so you have to expect that. You have to understand that that's going to happen. And then empower users to take ownership of their cookbooks. So this is a kicker. You have to, from the start, make sure that they're aware, especially if you're just starting out with Chef and you've never done anything like it before. From the start, you have to make sure they understand they will never be done. When you write a piece of code, you own that code. You maintain that code. It's not going to work forever. So hearing things like, this update's going to cause me to have to update my cookbook, or things like that, in a negative way, you need to make sure that you let them know that that's normal. You are always going to have to update your cookbook. That's just how this works. So also, on that same line, make sure that they understand that exact point. If you put it into code, be prepared to manage it. Don't just throw something out there that doesn't really make sense because it works today, because ultimately you are the one who owns that code. And then I wanted to talk about guardrails a little bit. So I mentioned standards earlier, and I'm using guardrails and standards loosely here. They don't have to exist forever. And sometimes they will feel somewhat restrictive. But in the beginning, it's important to give users those guardrails. Otherwise, they will go astray, processes will be broken, and it's really hard to bring all that back, to harness that back in. So basically always preach that these aren't forever, unless they are forever. But be clear. Say these need to be here for X, Y, and Z reason. But then these only need to be here for a short period of time. And this is why we're doing it. As an organization, it was important for everybody to have input, but it was also important to be safe whenever we were making this journey. We didn't start small at CARFAX. Whenever we started automating the things through Chef, we automated all the things through Chef. And we kind of started with, we have all the things ready, let's do it now. So the guardrails were critical in ensuring that the business was safe, our customers were safe, and they were still getting the product and the uptime that they expected. But at the same time, we were saving time because now our systems were managing themselves. And we no longer had to go click buttons and log into these systems. In saying that, I also want to stress that nothing in an organization, especially when using Chef, is finite. This goes back to if you put it in code, you own it now. It's going to have to be changed, but you're always moving forward. So just keep that in mind. So where are we now? What does Chef look like now at CARFAX? It's still not perfect, I'll be honest. But we are leaps and bounds away from where we were when we first started this journey. So we have hit some milestones with Chef that we're pretty proud of. Almost everyone in our data center is using Chef now. That is both infrastructure and developers. Even if they're not using Chef, they're interested in at least learning what is building our systems and what is managing our systems. So we often have development teams that have no interaction or plans to interact with Chef that will go through our Chef Essentials course internally just to learn how we're doing the things that we're doing. We're also migrating our systems that were built outside of Chef whenever we started this journey and moving them all into Chef. That's why our node count continues to grow. In doing that, we have to develop new cookbooks. We have to expand our knowledge. Each application is different, so we have to continue learning. But it's important to note that we're moving everything to Chef. And in the beginning, we didn't know if that was going to be possible. So we're also starting to look into other areas that are beneficial for CARFAX. One of those is compliance. So historically, we did not use compliance much. Now we're running our patch systems through Chef. We're using Chef to patch our systems monthly. And we're using a compliance profile, actually that happened recently, to monitor and make sure that those systems are actually being patched. If they're not being patched, what is it missing? What package is it missing? The next iteration of that will be, of course, to automatically go through and install the packages that are missing. So most importantly, our users are empowered now to use the system. They know that they can always reach out. There's always someone there to help them. And that, for me, is the important part. So with that, I want to give you some takeaways. Even, like I said before, even if you're at the bottom of the corporate stack, it doesn't matter. You should always strive to ensure that the people around you are empowered to be successful. Because if they're not successful, you're not successful. Because you're going to be picking up the slack for them. So it's important to bring them along this journey with you. And I think that kind of empowers the definition of DevOps, one of the 500 definitions of DevOps that you may find. Always empower the people around you. But also know that your Chef journey is never going to end. This is not a project. It does not stop. You have to continue always. You have to get better always. So outside of that, I know I talked really fast, and I'm sorry. I cheated my way through public speaking in college. What questions do you all have for me? What can I answer for you, if anything? The question was, how big is my organization and how many Chef users do we have? So a rough estimate, our organization probably has over 600 employees spread throughout the country. Our data center is in Columbia, Missouri. That's where a lot of our infrastructure teams are and some of our developers. In Columbia and in Virginia, really, I would say Chef user-wise, we probably have about 200, 250 at this point. That number continues to grow. Every team is starting to use Chef. So personally, the question was, how long have I been using Chef? So personally, I've been using Chef for a little over 3 years now. But at CARFAX, they had just adopted Chef but didn't have anything live when I started 2 years ago. Okay, the question was, how big is my Chef infrastructure? So I want to clarify really quick. Do you mean like the background stuff, like Automate server, Chef server, or do you mean like our node count? Okay, all of these things. So right now we have a Chef server, one Chef server, and then a background Chef server that our Automate server talks to. That is only there to take in the environments that are output by workflow that we don't have a use for. That's just to reduce confusion on our production Chef server. Outside of that, we have our Automate server, and we have an external Elasticsearch cluster. And then we have a server for old school compliance that we keep around just in case for scanning of Windows nodes if we decide to do that. But then we also have a supermarket server. As far as nodes, we have between 3,000 and 3,500 nodes today. And then that number grows every day. I could probably look at it tomorrow and it'll be 100 or more higher, just as we start migrating more servers into the system. There are two of us that are considered the chef experts, and our role as automation engineers is to kind of be that expert and be that point of contact for the rest of the users in the organization. We also manage that chef infrastructure for them to utilize and any feature requests or enhancements that they want to the pipeline or the process. And then any automation-related cookbooks we develop and maintain. Okay, so the question was, any tips for people resistant to change? Is that a good summation? So we did have some people that were resistant to change, obviously, but I think the way to battle resistance to change is through education. So the more you can teach them about how that tool can help them, it doesn't even matter if it's chef, it can be anything. The less afraid of it they are. Typically, they're resistant to change because they're afraid of it, they're afraid of not being able to learn it, or they're afraid that it's going to replace them, especially in the world of automation. It's important to make sure that they know they have a place, always they have a place, but also how much better this can make their life and what their role can look like if they eliminate all this time. Yes, so the question was whether we've involved our InfoSec team on compliance and what they thought about it. So we have met with our security team, and they love it. They love the reports. They love the abilities that come out of that. So now it's kind of just coordinating efforts, getting us both to have time to be able to go through and actually figure out what's going to be useful for us. Right now, the patch thing's useful for us because we're patching our systems with Chef. We would like to start doing CIS scanning and all of that through compliance. And we have some proof of concept systems that are running those scans right now. That way the security team can actually look through those reports and see how that can tie into their other processes. Okay, the question was, how well does the one chef server handle our 3,000 nodes? Really well, actually, surprisingly. The caveat, though, is not with the chef server, it's with Automate. So we have relatively large node objects because we're doing a lot of things with Chef. So we quickly realized that we needed that external Elasticsearch cluster to be able to handle the load. But the Chef server, no problems. Okay, so the question was, how did we handle users that may not have had a background in code, have never had to own code, and how did we kind of bring them in? So several of the infrastructure folks had never written code. They had written some scripts, but even those, like, they just hadn't done it. And that's the way we handled that was the Chef Essentials courses, and then also being available for them as a backbone until they got their feet wet, until they got comfortable in what they know. Ruby is a relatively straightforward language, but even outside of that, Chef resources are extremely easy to learn. It's just a matter of doing them and iterating that not everybody is the same. So it may take one person 2 months to learn something that another person learned in a day, and that's fine. It's just a matter of how comfortable they get and trying to get everyone on that same comfort level. So the trainings, to answer your question, the trainings were super imperative for those users, and not being judgmental if they maybe wanted to go through it twice. Just explaining to maybe their management, hey, I know they've already gone through this, but they would like to go through it again, and this is why I see benefit in that. So the question was, what sources did we leverage to figure out best practices, whether we did research or whether we did it ourselves? So a lot of it was best practices for CARFAX. And that was taking a step back and looking at the organization and saying, with forward thought, because it's important to have that forward thought. What is this going to look like in 5 years? But what do I need to do today? Stepping back and saying, this is what we need, and this is why we need it. But then also leveraging our customer success team at Chef and just asking, what is the rest of the industry doing? Because they may not be able to tell us, this is how you should do it and you will do it, but they can at least tell us what the industry looks like. They're out in the field all the time, seeing multiple customers do things multiple ways. So taking that information and what we know we need long-term and short-term and marrying those is how we developed our CARFAX best practices. Okay, the question was, with regard to guardrails, what controls do I feel work well? So one of the controls is ensuring everyone has a process, and that process is the process that's followed. An example of that would be our workflow pipeline. Part of the workflow is no longer pushing your changes to a branch out in Bitbucket. Also, you don't clone down from Bitbucket. You always clone from delivery. So I think putting the guardrail in place as part of the workflow that says delivery is your new source of truth. I think that was one of the ones that worked the best because that reduced confusion and problems with cookbooks. If somebody goes out and pushes something, which we've locked it down, so that's another guardrail, lock down master. Don't let anybody push to master. That one's important. But say we hadn't locked that down. If somebody goes and pushes something to master, that does not reflect what lives in the chef server. Delivery always reflects what lives in the chef server. So I think that's one of them. The other one I would say would be the version pinning. So giving everyone a standard, but also enforcing that standard. So as part of our pipeline, we reach out to the chef server and see if a cookbook has been pinned to something in our beta and production environments. Alpha does not have to be pinned because that's a test bed. So they can run latest or whatever version they want. But beta and production need to reflect each other pretty closely. So we reach out, and if that cookbook isn't there, if it doesn't exist in environments, we fail them. You cannot push that cookbook until you put it there. And that's how we ensure changes don't get pushed all the way out to production without any kind of test. They have to do things and do actions with intent. Yes, so the question was, do we have any plans to bring Windows into our chef environment? So we are probably 90 to 95% Linux at our organization. But we do have some Windows servers out there. We have talked with our Windows team and our chef team about bringing Windows into the fold. It's not something that we're doing today or tomorrow or maybe even this year, but it is something that I would like to see because I'm a firm believer in keeping all of your infrastructure the same. Automate it the same way. So it wouldn't make sense for us to use a different tool for Windows, in my opinion, and it may be an unpopular opinion, but it wouldn't make sense for us to use a separate tool, which means now you have teams that know how to do this, but not how to do this. So yes, we're talking about it. We would, actually. So we would have to modify the process a little bit, obviously, because we're using Yum and package management and all of that for Linux. But it's doable. We have talked about that, and it is doable. The question was, what was my experience with using workflow and approver and shipper and all of the different roles within? So, two things. One, pretty much everyone in my organization is an approver. The kind of rule of thumb is peer review. We found that the way our roles are aligned and the way we develop cookbooks and all of that would be really difficult for us to give somebody approver or shipper or one of the roles and not the other, just because of the way our processes work. So I don't have a lot of insight into how that works because it doesn't work for us. So it may be beneficial, it's just not something that we could do. Yeah, so the question is with containers becoming more popular, is there skepticism on the use of Chef? Is that a good summary? Okay, so yes, there is. But that's kind of why I've tried to start learning Habitat. So I feel like Habitat could impact our organization as we move to the cloud. As we leverage things like Kubernetes and all of those things, we all saw in the keynote the great things they're doing with Habitat. So I do see a place for Habitat, but there is some skepticism because why manage a non-stateful, a system that is no longer stateful? Our current infrastructure is going to live for a long time, so that's kind of a future Brittany problem, but I have started thinking about it. So I'll get into it a little bit, and then we can talk after if you want. The question was, what makes me go for Habitat and not plain and simple Docker? I just think that Habitat is really user-friendly. And that's saying that 1,000-foot view. That's me investigating Habitat and then going through the workshop yesterday. I don't have a lot of technical knowledge, experience, and it may not be the tool for us. But I would like for us to explore it because I do see that it has pretty powerful potential, especially to fill a gap that I think is kind of gaping right now. Okay, so that's a good question that I didn't cover. The question was, how do we manage community cookbooks and pins and updates for those cookbooks? So that is the one thing we pin in our cookbook. So if I have a wrapper cookbook, we'll say CARFAX New Relic, that calls and depends on the community version of New Relic. It is up to that cookbook owner to follow the update schedule of the community cookbook, and they pin it in their cookbook. Basically, public cookbooks, it's not up to us to put them in our environments. So it's important that the person that knows what they're doing with their cookbook, because we have so many teams managing cookbooks, that they put the pin there with intent. So we manage those in the cookbook itself, or the wrapper.
All right. If you guys will join me in welcoming or thanking Brittany.
Yeah.
Sorry, you can.
Oh, it's cool.
Yeah.